Her union meant to save an industry unleashed something far deeper. She wanted a truce. He wanted real change. But on their wedding night, a key will unlock secrets that will shake entire generations. Welcome to the channel. Before we begin, hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep creating stories like this one. The late afternoon light bathed the fields of blue agave that stretched as far as the eye could see, like an undulating sea that had brought fortune and prestige to the Monroe family for generations. At the center of that agricultural empire, Skyview Estate rose majestically, with its pink stone walls and red tiled roofs gleaming under the California sun. Eleanor Monroe Ingram observed her kingdom from the main balcony with the same serene expression she had perfected over the years, although inside she felt that something was about to break. At 39, she was the sole heir to the most prestigious distillery in the High Valley of California, a woman who inspired both admiration and fear among those who knew her. Her slender hands held a glass of aged whiskey, the same one that had won international awards and had catapulted the Monroe brand to the top of the global market. Miss Eleanor, the voice of Mrs. Constance, the housekeeper who had raised her since she was a child, interrupted her thoughts. Mr. Richard and the other board members are waiting for you in the library. Eleanor nodded without turning, taking a final sip from her glass. The moment had arrived. After weeks of growing tensions between the agave fieldworkers and the estate management, the family council had convened an emergency meeting. The strikes had intensified. Blockades of distribution trucks threatened the delivery of international orders, and union leaders demanded better conditions for the jimadors who cut the agave under the relentless sun. Eleanor crossed the hallways, adorned with portraits of her ancestors, men and women with severe looks who had built the Monroe Empire with a firm hand and, according to many, without too much consideration for those who worked the land. In the library, 5 men waited for her standing. The oldest of them, Don Richard Monroe, her uncle and chairman of the board, approached to kiss her cheek. "Niece, the situation is unsustainable," he began without preamble as the others took their seats. "If we don't reach an agreement with the workers, we'll lose this year's harvest, and you know what that means." Eleanor listened in silence to the reports, the financial projections, the veiled threats from political groups that were taking advantage of the situation to gain relevance. Finally, when everyone had finished speaking, Don Richard took an envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. "There is a solution, Eleanor, one that might seem radical, but that would resolve the conflict at its root." Eleanor opened the envelope and extracted a document along with a photograph. In it appeared a man with a face weathered by the sun, with an intense yet serene gaze. "His name is Jack Vega," explained Don Richard. "He's one of the most respected leaders among the workers. He's not the most vocal or the most extreme, but everyone listens to him. He's intelligent, honest, and knows the field like few others." Eleanor looked up, intuiting where the conversation was headed. "And what exactly are you proposing?" she asked, although she already knew the answer. It was Manuel Cortez, the family lawyer, who responded, "A matrimonial alliance, you and Vega. The perfect union between management and field, between tradition and change. A powerful symbol that would calm tensions and give us time to implement progressive reforms without losing control." The room fell silent. Eleanor looked at the photograph again. Jack Vega would be in his mid-40s, with a face that wasn't conventionally attractive, but conveyed a certain nobility. His eyes in particular seemed to contain something she couldn't quite decipher. "Is he in agreement?" she finally asked. "We haven't contacted him yet," replied Don Richard. "We wanted your approval first, but we believe he'll accept. It would be an honor for any man in his position, and besides, an opportunity to make many of the improvements. He's been requesting for his people a reality." Eleanor stood up and walked to the window. The agave field stretched out under the afternoon light, and in the distance, she could see the small houses where the families who had worked these lands for generations lived, families that depended on decisions like the one she was about to make. "Wouldn't it be simpler to directly improve their working conditions?" she asked, although she knew they had already considered that option. "The improvements will come, Eleanor," said Don Richard with a tired voice. "But we need a gesture, something that restores trust, something that shows we're willing to break with the past. 3 days later, Eleanor found herself in the small plaza of the town of St. Joseph of the Agaves, observing from the tinted window of her SUV the comings and goings of people at the weekly market. She had insisted on seeing Jack Vega in his environment before he knew anything about the proposal. She needed to form her own impression. She distinguished him among the crowd thanks to the descriptions provided to her. He walked confidently among the stalls, greeting people with familiarity, sometimes stopping to exchange a few words or help someone carry a heavy package. He didn't have the typical behavior of a revolutionary leader or an agitator. He seemed simply a man respected in his community. Eleanor asked her driver to discreetly follow Jack when he left the plaza. She saw him enter a small community library where he remained for more than an hour. That detail intrigued her. When he came out, he carried a book under his arm that Eleanor couldn't identify. Over the following days, Eleanor received detailed reports about Jack Vega. He had been born in the region, the son of Jimadors. He had studied through middle school, in the local school, standing out as a brilliant student, but without the possibility of continuing his formal education due to lack of resources. He had been working in the agave field since he was 15, and little by little had gained the trust of his companions until becoming a sort of informal representative. There were no records of violent or radical behavior. "He seems too perfect," commented Eleanor to her personal assistant Mercedes as they reviewed the information. "Don't you find it strange?" Mercedes, a pragmatic woman who had been in her service for years, shrugged. "Simple men are sometimes exactly what they seem, Eleanor. Not everyone has hidden agendas." A week after the meeting in the library, Donci Richard informed Eleanor that Jack Vega had been contacted and that, surprisingly, he had agreed to meet to discuss the proposal. "He didn't seem either offended or enthusiastic," he explained. "He just said he was willing to listen to any idea that could benefit his people." The meeting was arranged on neutral ground, a small restored chapel on the outskirts of town, a discreet place where no one would suspect that the heir to the Monroes and a field worker were discussing a marriage of convenience. Eleanor arrived first, accompanied only by Mercedes. She dressed with deliberate simplicity, though the quality of her clothes still betrayed her position. Jack Vega arrived punctually, alone. He wore a clean and well-ironed shirt, jeans without stains or tears. His posture was upright, his gaze direct. "Miss Monroe," he greeted with a slight nod. His voice was deeper and more modulated than Eleanor had imagined. "Mr. Vega," she responded, extending her hand. His handshake was firm but not aggressive. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Curiosity sometimes outweighs prudence," he replied, with what seemed like the hint of a smile. "Not every day does one receive such an unusual proposal." The conversation that followed was surprisingly frank. Eleanor explained the situation from the perspective of the family business, the need to modernize without losing the essence, to improve working conditions without compromising economic viability. Jack, for his part, spoke of the difficulties of the working families, of their hopes, of the dignity they sought beyond a simple wage increase. Neither directly mentioned the marriage until they had been talking for almost an hour. It was Eleanor who finally addressed the topic. "Why would you agree to marry someone like me, Mr. Vega? We are from completely different worlds." Jack looked at her for a long time before responding. "Precisely for that reason, Miss Monroe. Because it's time those worlds stopped being so different." There was something in his gaze, an intensity that didn't quite fit with his supposed simplicity, that made Eleanor feel a chill. For an instant, she had the feeling that the man sitting across from her wasn't exactly who he claimed to be. But the sensation passed as quickly as it had come. "I don't expect love, of course," Jack continued. "Not even friendship, though that would be desirable with time. Just a mutual commitment to something greater than ourselves." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And when will I know if you formally accept the proposal?" "I've already decided," he replied, with a calmness that disconcerted her. "If you are willing, so am I." 2 weeks later, the news of the engagement between Eleanor Monroe, heir to the whiskey empire, and Jack Vega, representative of the agave workers, shocked all of California. The media called it the marriage that united the valley, an unprecedented alliance between rural aristocracy and working people. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 months later, time enough for both parties to prepare for the radical change that was about to come. What no one knew, not even Eleanor, was that Jack Vega harbored secrets much deeper than anyone could imagine. Secrets that would begin to be revealed on the wedding night itself, when Eleanor would accidentally find a small object, hidden in her new husband's luggage, an ancient key with an engraved symbol that she immediately recognized as the coat of arms of a family that had supposedly been extinct for decades, a family that had been the bitter rival of the Monroes in the dawn of the whiskey industry in California. The wedding day dawned with a clear, bright sky, as if even the weather wanted to favor that symbolic union that promised to bring peace to the region. The ceremony took place in the chapel of Skyview Estate, a colonial enclosure restored with care where generations of Monroes had married. For the first time in history, the doors were opened not only to the elite of California, but also to dozens of agave field workers who attended with a mixture of amazement and pride. Eleanor walked down the central aisle in a designer dress that, although elegant, she had chosen for its relative simplicity. She didn't want opulence to overshadow the message of that day. When she reached the altar and looked at Jack, dressed in a dark suit that fit him surprisingly well, she couldn't help but notice how strange the situation was. There she was, about to unite her life with that of a man she barely knew, for the good of a family business and social peace. He, for his part, maintained that serene and indecipherable expression that Eleanor had begun to find intriguing. During the reception, which extended throughout the estate gardens, Eleanor observed with curiosity how Jack moved between two worlds. With the workers, he was close and natural, but when he interacted with businessmen, politicians, and members of other prominent families, he showed an ease that was disconcerting in someone of his supposed origin. At one point, she saw him conversing fluently in English with the European ambassador, using technical terms about the international whiskey market that very few in the industry mastered. "Your husband is a box of surprises," commented Don Richard, approaching Eleanor with a glass in hand. He just impressed the ambassador with an analysis of the implications of the new trade treaty for appellations of origin. Eleanor nodded, hiding her own surprise. "It seems he has been studying to adapt to his new role," she responded, although a slight uneasiness was beginning to form within her. That night, alone in the main suite of the estate they would now share, Eleanor and Jack maintained a cordial but distant conversation. They had agreed that their marriage would be, at least initially, a strategic partnership rather than a romantic union. They would sleep in connected but separate rooms, maintaining appearances to the outside world. "I must thank you," said Jack, as they shared a last glass of whiskey on the balcony under the starry California sky. "Not many people in your position would have accepted something like this." Eleanor looked at him carefully. Under the moonlight, his face seemed more refined, less weathered by the sun than she had noticed before. "I did it for the company and for peace in our community," she responded frankly, "just as you did it for your people." Jack nodded, thoughtful. "There are decisions we make, thinking of something bigger than ourselves. Although sometimes destiny has plans we don't anticipate." There was something in his tone, a cadence in his speech, that didn't quite fit with the image of a man who had only completed middle school and had spent his life in the agave fields. Eleanor decided to try a small strategy. "Tell me more about yourself, Jack, about your childhood, your family." He smiled slightly. "There's not much to tell. I was born here in St. Joseph of the agaves. My father and grandfather were jimadors. I grew up among the agave fields, learning to distinguish mature plants, to use the koa to extract the piña." His account sounded authentic, but Eleanor noticed that he avoided specific details, names, dates. "And how did you learn to speak English so well?" she asked directly. Jack barely blinked at the question. "Internet, audiobooks, and practice with tourists who visit the distilleries. I've always had a facility for languages." The answer was plausible, but didn't entirely dispel Eleanor's doubts. After politely saying goodnight, each retired to their respective room. Alone, Eleanor couldn't resist the temptation to examine Jack's luggage, which had been moved to the adjoining room. There wasn't much, simple but good quality clothes, some books, a watch that seemed expensive for someone of his supposed income, and a small carved wooden box. She tried to open it, but it was locked. It was then, looking for the key, that she found an object carefully wrapped in a silk handkerchief in the bottom of an inside pocket of his suitcase. An ancient key with an engraved shield that she immediately recognized. It was the emblem of the Walters family, old rivals of the Monroes in the beginnings of the whiskey industry, a family that was said to have disappeared after a tragedy decades ago. Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. What was Jack Vega doing with a relic of the Walters, and how to explain the contrast between his apparent simplicity and the details that didn't fit? She decided not to confront him yet. She needed more information. The following weeks passed with a strange normality. Eleanor and Jack established a routine as a public marriage and private partners. In the mornings, they had breakfast together, discussing the plans for the day. He had begun to get involved in the management of the estate, especially regarding the working conditions of the employees. To the surprise of many, he demonstrated a notable understanding of financial and legal aspects that went far beyond what would be expected. During the afternoons, Eleanor watched him interact with the staff, always attentive and respectful, but maintaining a distance that contradicted the image of the man of the people that everyone expected. At night, she often found him in the library, absorbed in texts about international trade, whiskey history, or classical literature that seemed to interest him deeply. One day, approximately a month after the wedding, Eleanor returned unexpectedly to the estate after a meeting in the city was cancelled. As she passed by the office she had assigned to Jack, she heard his voice speaking what seemed to be fluent French. She stopped, surprised, and listened through the half-open door. Oui, je comprends l'importance de cette négociation, Jack was saying with an impeccable accent. Mais nous devons procéder avec prudence. Les implications politiques pourraient être complexes. Eleanor held her breath. French? Negotiations with political implications? When the call ended, she entered the office as if she had just arrived, finding Jack calmly reviewing some documents. Eleanor, I wasn't expecting you so early, he said naturally. How was your meeting? It was cancelled at the last minute, she replied, studying his face for signs of nervousness. She found none. You were on the phone, she commented casually. I thought I heard you speaking another language. Jack smiled slightly. Basic French. I learned it years ago from a radio program. I sometimes practice with a friend who lives in Montreal. The explanation sounded reasonable, but Eleanor could no longer ignore the inconsistencies. That night, during dinner, she decided to probe again. Jack, tell me about your family. You mentioned your father and grandfather, but never with details. Do you have siblings? Is your mother still alive? He put down his cutlery for a moment and looked at her directly. My mother passed away when I was a child. I don't have siblings. There's not much more to tell, Eleanor. We're a simple family. And there are no photographs, mementos. It's strange that you haven't brought anything personal to the estate. For the first time, Eleanor noticed a flash of something, discomfort, caution, in Jack's eyes. I lost many things in a fire years ago, he finally responded, including family photographs. Sometimes it's better not to cling too much to the past. The answer closed the conversation, but multiplied Eleanor's doubts. That same night, while Jack attended a meeting with union representatives in town, Eleanor made a decision. She needed to know more about this man with whom she had united her life and the future of the family business. She called Martin Suarez, an old friend from university, who now worked in financial intelligence for the federal government. I need a discreet favor, she told him after the customary greetings. Information about someone, complete, detailed, and confidential. 2 days later, Martin sent her a sealed envelope with the preliminary information he had been able to gather about Jack Vega. The file was surprisingly thin. According to official records, Jack had been born in St. Joseph of the Agaves 35 years ago, not 42 as he claimed. His parents were listed as Joseph Vega and Mary Durant, but there were no death certificates for either of them, despite Jack having mentioned that both had passed away. More disturbing still, There were no school records in his name at the local school where he had supposedly studied through middle school. It could be an administrative error, Martin had noted next to the report. Rural records from that era are often incomplete. But Eleanor sensed there was something more. She decided to take a bolder step, taking advantage of the fact that Jack would spend the next day in the city in meetings related to whiskey exports. Eleanor organized a visit to St. Joseph of the Agaves, specifically to the town elders, who might remember the Vega family if they had really been lifelong residents as Jack claimed. Accompanied by Mercedes, her trusted assistant, she first visited Mrs. Remedios, an 80-year-old woman who had been a midwife in the town for decades. "The Vega family?" repeated the old woman when Eleanor asked her, frowning in an effort to remember. "There were some Vegas who lived near the river, but they left many years ago. I don't remember them having a son named Jack." She received a similar response from Mr. Prospero, a former schoolteacher, and from 3 other elderly people who should have known any local family during that period. No one clearly remembered a boy named Jack Vega growing up in the town. "It's as if he appeared out of nowhere about 10 years ago," commented Mercedes as they returned to the estate. "Do you think he's been lying all this time?" Eleanor looked thoughtfully out the car window. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Upon arriving at the estate, an additional surprise awaited her. Jack had returned earlier than expected and was meeting with Mr. Augustus Hernandez, the former administrator of the estate, who had retired 5 years ago after 4 decades of service to the Monroe family. Eleanor found them on the terrace, conversing animatedly like old acquaintances. "Eleanor," Jack greeted her naturally. "Mr. Augustus was passing by and decided to say hello. We were remembering old times." "Old times?" asked Eleanor, disconcerted. Mr. Augustus, a 70-year-old man with a face furrowed by expression lines, smiled affably. "I was telling your husband how glad I am to see how everything has changed for the better. The tension between the estate and the workers has decreased notably since your marriage." "Mr. Augustus knows the history of this region well," commented. Jack and Eleanor noticed a peculiar gleam in his eyes. "He was telling me about the early years of the whiskey industry and the founding families." "Including the Walters," added Mr. Augustus. "A true tragedy what happened to them." Eleanor felt a chill, the key with the Walters coat of arms that she had found among Jack's belongings came forcefully back to her mind. After Mr. Augustus left, Eleanor could no longer contain herself. "Who are you really, Jack?" she asked directly when they were alone. "Because each day I become more certain that you aren't who you claim to be." He looked at her for a long time, as if evaluating what to respond. Finally, with a calmness that was almost disturbing, he said, "We are all more than what we appear to be, Eleanor, even you, but you're right. There are parts of my story that I haven't shared. Perhaps it's time for you to know some of them." He stood up and took from his pocket the same key that Eleanor had discovered weeks earlier. "This key opens a door to a past you believed buried. The question is, are you really prepared for what's behind it?" Eleanor felt her heart beating strongly. She was about to discover a truth that could change everything, not just about the man she had married, but possibly about the very history of her family and the estate that had been her home throughout her life. "Show me," she said. Simply, Jack nodded, and with a gesture invited her to follow him to a part of the estate that had gone unused for years. The old underground cellars where, according to family stories, documents and valuable objects had been stored during turbulent times. Eleanor had never paid much attention to those tales, considering them part of family folklore, but as she followed Jack down the dimly lit hallway, she began to wonder how many other secrets the century-old walls of Skyview Estate concealed, and what role this enigmatic man truly played in the history she was about to discover. The ancient, underground cellars of Skyview Estate smelled of damp earth and suspended time. Eleanor had never descended so deep into that part of the property. A labyrinth of tunnels and small chambers that, according to family stories, had served both to store whiskey barrels and to hide documents and valuable objects during turbulent times. Jack advanced with surprising confidence, as if he knew the way by heart. something that seemed impossible for someone who had supposedly set foot on the estate for the first time just a few months ago. "How do you know where to go?" asked Eleanor, as their steps echoed on the stone floor. "Research," he replied without turning. "The original plans of the estate are archived in the historical registry of the city. Anyone can consult them." The answer was logical, but it didn't dispel the feeling that Jack was too familiar with a place that should be foreign to him. Finally, they reached a small circular chamber. The light from the flashlight Jack carried revealed bare stone walls and a dusty floor, with nothing particularly notable at first glance. However, Jack went directly to a specific point on the wall, where he pressed a stone that seemed identical to the others. To Eleanor's amazement, an ancient but well-preserved mechanism caused a section of the wall to slide to one side, revealing a hidden small chamber. "This doesn't appear on any official plan," murmured Eleanor, surprised. "Because no one was supposed to find it," replied Jack, inserting the key with the Walters coat of arms into an almost invisible lock in the inner wall. The small door that opened revealed a space the size of a closet, where a carved wooden chest rested, blackened by time. Jack carefully extracted it and placed it on the floor between them. Before opening it, he said, looking directly at Eleanor, "You must understand that what it contains could change the way you see your family, your heritage, even this land." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "What does this chest have to do with the Walters and with you?" "Everything," he replied simply, and proceeded to open it with the same key. The inside of the chest was meticulously organized. It contained yellowed documents, old photographs, a small leather-bound diary, and an old pistol that Eleanor recognized as a model from the early 20th century. "This diary belonged to Edward Walters," began Jack, taking it reverently, "the last official patriarch of the Walters family, rival to the Monroes in the dawn of the whiskey industry." Eleanor vaguely knew the story. The Walters had been a powerful family, owners of extensive lands and distilleries that competed directly with the Monroes for market dominance. According to the official history, the family had become extinct after a tragic accident that ended the life of the patriarch and his immediate family, allowing the Monroes to acquire part of their lands. The version everyone knows is that Edward Walters, his wife Isabel, and their elder children perished in the fire at their estate in 1978, continued Jack, opening the diary to a marked page. What no one knew was that the youngest son, a boy of barely 3 years named Alexander, survived thanks to a maid who hid him when she heard the first gunshots. "Gunshots?" interrupted Eleanor, confused. "The official story speaks of an accidental fire." Jack looked at her intensely. "The fire wasn't an accident, Eleanor. It was set to cover up a crime. And according to this diary and other documents I've gathered over the years, the intellectual mastermind was your grandfather, Franklin Monroe." Eleanor felt as if she'd been doused with ice water. "That's impossible. My grandfather was an honorable man respected by the entire community. Your grandfather was an ambitious man who saw the opportunity to eliminate his main competitor," replied Jack with a calm but firm voice. "The Walters had developed a revolutionary distillation method that threatened to catapult them above the Monroes. Edward Walters was about to patent the process and secure international contracts that would have forever changed the balance of power in the industry." He spread several documents on the floor, detailed plans of a modified still, chemical formulas, letters of intent from European and American buyers. "And this," he added, showing a contract dated just 1 week before the fire, "is an agreement signed between Edward Walters and the federal government to establish the first training school in high-quality whiskey production, a project that would have benefited the entire region, but especially the Walters family." Eleanor reviewed the documents with a mixture of disbelief and growing horror. She recognized the notarial seal, signatures of officials of the time. Everything seemed authentic. "But this doesn't prove that my grandfather was involved in whatever you're insinuating." "Perhaps this will," replied Jack, extracting a yellowed envelope from the bottom of the chest. From it, he took a black and white photograph where 2 men appeared next to a car of the era. One was clearly her, Grandfather, Franklin Monroe, much younger but unmistakable. The other, a sinister-looking man, was marked on the back of the photo as Roger Smith, hitman from Jacksonville. The date handwritten was 3 days before the fire at the Walters estate. According to the testimony of the maid who saved the key, child collected in this document, continued Jack, showing a notarized statement. 3 men broke into the estate that night. They first killed Edward and his wife, then the 2 older children. Afterward, they started the fire to cover up the crime. Eleanor felt short of breath. If this is true, why was it never investigated? Why are there no official records? There were, replied Jack, but they mysteriously disappeared from judicial archives. Your grandfather had powerful connections, Eleanor. Politicians, judges, even within the police. In that era, with the right amounts of money, it was possible to rewrite history. Eleanor put her hands to her face, trying to process all that information. If what Jack was showing was true, the family fortune, the Monroe whiskey empire, had been built on a horrendous crime. And the boy, she finally asked. Alexander Walters, what happened to him? Jack was silent for a moment, as if measuring his words. The maid took him to a distant cousin of the family, a modest man who lived on the coast of Oregon. Growing up far from here with another name, without knowing his true origin until many years later. Eleanor looked at him fixedly, suddenly understanding. It's you. You are Alexander Walters. Jack, or Alexander, nodded slowly. I am. Although Jack Vega is also real. It's the name I grew up with, the identity they gave me to protect me. And all this? Asked Eleanor, gesturing around them, tension evident in her voice. Our marriage? Was it part of some revenge plan, marrying the granddaughter of the man who destroyed your family? It wasn't revenge I was seeking, Eleanor, he replied with a frankness that was disconcerting. It was justice and recovering what legitimately belongs to my family. The estate, the distillery? Eleanor's face reflected incredulity. Everything that belonged to the Walters legally passed into the hands of the Monroes. There are documents, purchase contracts. Contracts signed under coercion by Edward's distant relatives who had no idea what had really happened, interrupted Jack Alexander. Contracts that could be nullified if the truth about the crime came to light, even after so many years. Eleanor felt her head spinning. Her world, her family history, everything she thought she knew was being questioned. When did you discover your true identity? She asked, trying to gain time to organize her thoughts. At 18, my uncle, the man who raised me as Jack Vega, was ill, knew he had little time left. He gave me the diary, some photographs, told me the truth about my parents. But he didn't have all the documents you see here. I gathered those little by little over years. And how did you come to St. Joseph of the Agaves, to the agave fields, to being a leader among the workers? Jack smiled slightly. That part wasn't planned. I came to the region to investigate, to be close and search for evidence. I began working in the fields because I needed to earn a living and incidentally learn the business from the ground up. What I didn't expect was to become fond of the people, of their daily struggle. I became their representative because I truly believed in improving their conditions, not just as part of my personal quest. Eleanor processed all this information, trying to separate truth from manipulation. So, when the proposal of our marriage arose, it was an opportunity I couldn't pass up, he admitted. It gave me direct access to the estate, to its archives, to places like this. But it was also a genuine opportunity to improve the conditions of the workers, something I sincerely believe in. He approached her and took her hands with a gentleness that surprised her. What I didn't anticipate, Eleanor, was what I would begin to feel for you. Eleanor abruptly withdrew her hands. Do you expect me to believe that, after discovering that our entire relationship has been part of a plan to, what? Claim what you believe belongs to you? Expose my family? I don't expect you to believe it now, he replied calmly. Only that you consider the possibility that my motives are more complex than they appear, and that you understand I'm not the only one who has been hiding information. Eleanor frowned. What do you mean? By way of answer, Jack extracted a more recent sealed envelope from the chest. This is a report from a private investigator I hired 3 weeks ago when I noticed you had begun investigating me. Here it contains information about a secret meeting between Don Richard, your uncle, and several members of the family council a week before they proposed you marry me. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. You were investigating me. I was protecting myself, he corrected, and I discovered something interesting. The marriage wasn't your uncle's idea to calm social tensions, as they made you believe. It was Don Gustavo Velázquez's idea. Don Gustavo? The general administrator? Eleanor was increasingly confused. Don Gustavo had been her father's right hand. Man for decades, and after his death, had remained as the family's principal advisor. Why would Don Gustavo be interested in me marrying you? Because he knows who I really am, replied Jack seriously. He knew from the moment I began working in the agave fields. He worked for your grandfather during the time of the fire, was his personal assistant. He probably knew the details of the plan against the Walters. This is absurd, murmured Eleanor, but a part of her was beginning to see disturbing coincidences. Don Gustavo had always shown a special interest in keeping certain aspects of family history secret, especially related to the acquisition of lands that previously belonged to the Walters. If what you're saying is true, why would Don Gustavo facilitate our marriage? That would give you access to everything you need to expose the truth. Jack was silent for a moment. I believe Don Gustavo is playing his own game, a game that neither you nor I fully understand yet. He took a small notebook from his shirt pocket and handed it to Eleanor. These are notes I've taken about irregular financial movements in family business, accounts over the last 5 years, money that disappears, transfers to accounts in tax havens, contracts with phantom suppliers, millions of dollars that vanish without explanation. Eleanor took the notebook with trembling hands. She had noticed some discrepancies in recent financial reports, but Don Gustavo always had plausible explanations, backed by Don Richard. My theory, continued Jack, is that Don Gustavo has been slowly bleeding the Monroe Company, preparing for his retirement, and he saw in our union a perfect opportunity to divert attention while he concludes his plan. A family scandal, the revelation of old crimes, the struggle for the legitimacy of property, all that would keep everyone so busy that no one would notice what he's been doing with the money. Eleanor sat on the dusty floor, overwhelmed by the amount of revelations. Her marriage, which she believed a sacrifice for the good of the family business and social peace, turned out to be an elaborate manipulation with multiple layers of deception. Her own family, whom she had always admired and respected, could be stained by terrible crimes, and the man she had married wasn't a simple worker, but the last heir to a rival family, with complex motives and his own agendas. I need time, she finally said, time to process all this, to verify the information on my own. I understand, replied Jack, but we don't have much time. If my suspicions about Don Gustavo are correct, he's in the final stages of his plan, and when he discovers we've found this chamber and these documents, he won't hesitate to accelerate his movements. Eleanor looked at him fixedly. Why should? I trust you. Everything I know about you is a lie. Not everything, he replied with an intensity that disconcerted her. My commitment to the workers is real. My desire for justice, not revenge, is real. And what I've begun to feel for you, Eleanor, is also real, though it was never in my plans. He approached her again, this time without trying to touch her. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to trust the evidence, the facts. Investigate on your own if you want. Verify each document, each statement. But do it quickly because I suspect Don Gustavo already knows we're on his trail. Eleanor nodded slowly. What will you do in the meantime? Will you continue pretending to be my devoted husband before everyone? A shadow of sadness crossed Jack's face. I'm no longer pretending, Eleanor. That's the problem. Without saying more, he began to carefully collect the documents and return them to the chest. Eleanor watched him, divided between distrust and a strange sensation that, despite all the lies, there was a fundamental truth in the words of this enigmatic man. When they returned to the surface, the late afternoon light bathed the estate in golden and reddish tones. Eleanor stopped for a moment, contemplating the property she had always considered her legitimate home and heritage. Now, each stone, each corner, seemed to contain dark secrets waiting to be revealed. "I need to make some calls," she finally said, "and consult certain documents in my father's office. If what you say about Don Gustavo is true, I'll need concrete evidence." Jack nodded. "Be discreet," he warned. "Don Gustavo has eyes and ears throughout the estate." "And you?" she asked. "What will you do?" "I'll maintain appearances," he replied, "and continue investigating on my own. There are more pieces to this puzzle that still don't fit." They looked at each other in silence for a moment, aware that, regardless of what they discovered in the coming days, nothing would ever be the same again. Their marriage of convenience had transformed into an uncertain alliance between two people, trapped in a web of lies, secrets, and possible betrayals that extended beyond themselves. As they moved away in opposite directions, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder if she would ever know the complete truth about the man who was now her husband. Who was he really? The last Walters seeking justice? A manipulator with a hidden agenda? Or, as he himself had hinted, a man divided between his past and the unexpected feelings that had arisen in the present? What Eleanor didn't know was that someone had observed them emerge from the underground cellars. From a window on the second floor, Don Gustavo Velázquez had followed their movements with a somber expression, and as he picked up his phone to make an urgent call, his eyes reflected not only concern, but also a cold determination that foreshadowed even darker events on the horizon. Night fell over Skyview Estate like a mantle of uncertainty. Eleanor locked herself in the office that had belonged to her father, a sanctuary of dark wood and leather-bound books that had always provided comfort. That night, however, each familiar object seemed to watch her with accusing eyes, as if the walls themselves knew secrets she was just beginning to discover. She opened the hidden safe behind a painting of the original distillery, where her father kept the family's most important documents. She spent hours reviewing deeds, contracts, old correspondence, searching for any indication that would confirm or disprove the story that Jack, or Alexander, as she should call him now, had revealed to her. Near midnight, she found a yellowed envelope labeled Acquisition Walters Properties, 1978. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, she found the purchase contract for the lands that had previously belonged to the Walters family. The terms were surprisingly favorable to the Munros, a price well below market value, clauses that prevented the sellers from later questioning the agreement, and an immediate transfer of all patent rights and registered trademarks. What caught her attention most, however, was a small attached memorandum, handwritten by her grandfather. "Gustavo has taken care of making Eduardo's cousins sign without too many questions. The Walters matter is definitively closed. Destroy any documentation related to RS and the incident of 7/17. RS Roger Smith, the hitman who appeared in the photograph Jack had shown her." Eleanor felt a chill. The evidence, although circumstantial, pointed in the direction he had indicated. Her grandfather did indeed seem to be involved in something shady related to the disappearance of the Walters, and Don Gustavo had been part of it from the beginning. But many questions remained unanswered. She decided to take a bolder step, review the recent financial reports that Don Gustavo personally handled. As general director, she had theoretical access to all company documents, but in practice, Don Gustavo and her uncle Richard had kept certain aspects of administration away from her, with the excuse of not overwhelming her with technical details. Now she understood why. After several hours of meticulous review, she found exactly what Jack had suggested: irregular transfers to offshore accounts, contracts with non-existent suppliers, funds diverted through complex financial structures. The magnitude of the fraud was astonishing. Millions of dollars flowing out of the family business coffers to unknown destinations. And all operations bore, in one way or another, the signature or authorization of Don Gustavo. with the approval of her Uncle Richard. Dawn surprised her still working, with dozens of documents spread across the desk and a painful certainty forming inside her. Her family, her legacy, everything she thought she knew was built on lies and crimes she had never suspected. When she finally left the office, she found Jack waiting for her in the hallway, with evident signs of having also spent a sleepless night. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked in a tired voice. Eleanor looked at him steadily, evaluating once more this man who had entered her life under false pretenses, but who, paradoxically, seemed to be the only one willing to show her the truth. "Enough to know we need to talk," she responded. "But not here, not now." They agreed to meet later in a safe place, far from the ears and eyes of the estate. At breakfast, Eleanor maintained a facade of normality before the staff, while discreetly observing Don Gustavo, who seemed particularly tense that morning. "I understand you spent the night in your father's office," he commented casually, while taking his coffee. "I hope it's not financial concerns keeping you awake." There was something in his tone, a note of false concern that now seemed obvious to Eleanor. How had she not noticed it before? "Just nostalgia," she lied with a studied smile. "Reviewing old family memories." Don Gustavo nodded, but his eyes revealed a flash of suspicion. "Memories are valuable," he responded, "but sometimes it's better to leave the past where it belongs." At noon, Eleanor informed Mercedes that she would be going to the city for a meeting with her personal lawyer. It was a necessary lie. Not even her trusted assistant could be told the truth at that moment. In reality, she headed to a small cabin in the mountains, a refuge her father had occasionally used and that few knew about. Jack arrived shortly after, having taken precautions to ensure no one was following him. "You were right," admitted Eleanor, without preamble. "I found evidence suggesting my grandfather's involvement in what happened to your family, and I confirmed Don Gustavo's financial irregularities." She showed him copies of the most relevant documents she had discovered. Jack examined them with a grave expression. "It's worse than I thought," he murmured. "From the amounts and the pattern of transfers, Don Gustavo isn't simply preparing for retirement. He's systematically emptying the company coffers." "For what purpose?" asked Eleanor. "Simple greed." Jack shook his head. "I think there's something more. The dates of the largest transfers coincide with specific moments. When tensions with the workers began, when the idea of our marriage arose, and the most recent last night itself." The last piece of information startled Eleanor. "Last night? How do you know?" "I have a contact at the company's main bank," explained Jack. "Someone who owes me some favors and who has been monitoring Don Gustavo's movements for me. Last night, shortly after midnight, $10 million were transferred to an account in the Cayman Islands." Eleanor remembered seeing Don Gustavo watching them when they emerged from the underground cellars. "He knows we've discovered him," she concluded, "and he's accelerating his plan, whatever it is." "Precisely," confirmed Jack, "but there's something else you should know." He extracted a small USB drive from his pocket. "This contains information I've gathered over years about your family, the Walters, and Don Gustavo, including something I discovered just a few days ago that changes everything I thought I knew." He connected the drive to a laptop he had brought with him. On the screen appeared a series of scanned documents, birth certificates, old photographs, and a meticulously elaborated family tree. According to the official story, Edward Walters and Franklin Monroe were business rivals, fierce competitors without any personal relationship. The reality was much more complicated. He pointed to 2 birth certificates. Isabel Monroe, younger sister of your grandfather Franklin, secretly married Edward Walters in 1950, against the wishes of both families. She was repudiated by the Monroes and adopted her husband's surname. She was my grandmother, my father's mother. Eleanor looked at him surprised. "Are you saying our families were related?" "More than that," replied Jack. "I'm saying the conflict between the Monroes and the Walters wasn't just a commercial rivalry. It was a family conflict, an open wound from a union that neither of the 2 families accepted." He moved to another image, a photograph of a young couple with a baby. "My parents, Edward Walters Jr. and Maria Coley, with me in their arms, a year before the fire. Eleanor observed the photograph carefully. The resemblance between the Edward Walters in the photo and the man seated before her was undeniable. But there's more, continued Jack, now showing a legal document. This is the will of Isabel Monroe Walters, my grandmother. In it, she specifies that in case something happened to her and her husband, the guardianship of their children should pass to her brother Franklin Monroe. Her brother who had publicly repudiated her, but with whom she apparently maintained some sort of secret contact. Are you suggesting that my grandfather knew there were survivors of the fire? That he knew of your existence? Jack nodded gravely. And not only that, I believe Don Gustavo also knew, and that he's been watching me since I returned to the region. What I can't determine is why he allowed all this to happen, why he facilitated our marriage if he knew who I really was. Eleanor tried to process all this new information, the ramifications of these secret family ties that completely altered her understanding of the past. Wait, she suddenly said, remembering something. You mentioned that the largest transfer coincided with the beginning of labor tensions. Do you think Don Gustavo was also behind those conflicts? I'm almost certain, confirmed Jack. The problems began too suddenly and in a coordinated manner, and some of the workers most vocal in the initial protests mysteriously disappeared afterward, only to be seen later with evident signs of sudden prosperity. A pattern was beginning to emerge, a large-scale manipulation that went far beyond what either of them had initially imagined. Don Gustavo has been orchestrating everything, murmured Eleanor. The labor tensions, our marriage, possibly even your return to the region. The question is why, replied Jack. What does he gain by creating this elaborate scenario? Eleanor reflected for a moment. Control, she finally said, and a perfect distraction. While everyone is focused on the family drama and labor conflicts, he can empty the company coffers without anyone noticing, and when everything explodes, he'll have disappeared with millions, completed Jack, leaving us to deal with the chaos and possibly face each other over revelations about the past. They looked at each other in silence, aware that they had been pawns in a game much bigger than they had imagined. We need to stop him, said Eleanor with determination, but we need concrete evidence, something we can present not only to the family but to the authorities. I think I know where to find it, replied Jack. Don Gustavo maintains a safety deposit box in a bank in the city. My contact informed me that he visits it regularly, always after making large transfers. How could we access it? We can't, at least not directly, but there's another way. He explained his plan. Confront Don Richard, Eleanor's uncle, with the evidence they already had. As president of the family council and co-signatory on many of the fraudulent documents, Don Richard was implicated, but possibly didn't know the full magnitude of the fraud. If we show him what we know, that Don Gustavo is emptying the company, he might turn against him to save himself. It was a risky plan. Don Richard could decide to align with Don Gustavo or alert him to their suspicions, but if it worked, they could gain access to crucial information that only the council president could provide. They agreed to act that very night, during a dinner Don Richard would host at his home to celebrate a new export contract. It would be a perfect occasion. Don Gustavo would be present but busy with guests, giving them time to speak privately with Don Richard. Back at the estate, Eleanor and Jack maintained appearances, acting like the perfectly normal married couple everyone expected to see. However, there was a subtle change in their interaction, a new dimension of complicity and trust, born of shared revelations. There's something I still don't understand, commented Eleanor as they prepared for dinner. If you're the legitimate heir of the Walters, why didn't you legally claim what belongs to you? With all those documents you've gathered. Jack looked at her with an expression that mixed sadness and determination. I tried 6 years ago. I hired a lawyer, filed a lawsuit. 3 days later, the lawyer received threats against his family. A week later, his office was burned down. The message was clear. He approached her, gently taking her hands. Eleanor, what I was seeking by coming here changed over time. At First it was justice, recovering what was taken from my family. Then it was truth, truly understanding what had happened. And now, he paused, as if the words were difficult to find. Now the only thing I want is to protect you from the lies that have surrounded you all your life. Because despite how everything began, the deceptions and half-truths, what I feel for you is the only thing completely real and sincere in this entire story. Eleanor felt a complex emotion bloom in her chest, a mixture of vulnerability and strength she had never experienced. This man, who had entered her life as an imposter, had paradoxically become the most honest person in her circle. I believe you, she responded simply, and whatever truth we find tonight, we'll face it together. Don Richard's mansion, an imposing colonial construction on the outskirts of the city, shimmered with lights and music when they arrived. The cream of California society was present. Politicians, businessmen, local celebrities. Don Gustavo received them at the entrance with his usual courtesy, though Eleanor noticed an underlying tension in his behavior, especially when his eyes briefly rested on Jack. "Good to see you, you seem the perfect couple," he commented with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don Richard is in the library, attending to some matters before joining the party. He mentioned he wanted to talk to you, Eleanor." Something in his tone triggered Eleanor's internal alarms. Was it a coincidence that he mentioned exactly the place where they planned to confront her uncle? She exchanged a quick look with Jack, who also seemed to have noticed something strange. "I'll go see him right away," Eleanor responded with studied normality. "Jack, why don't you come with me?" Don Gustavo made a dismissive gesture. "Oh, I'm sure Jack will want to greet his old companions. Several representatives of the workers are present tonight, as a symbol of the new era of cooperation you two have inaugurated." The maneuver was obvious. He was trying to separate them. Jack slightly squeezed Eleanor's hand. "My wife and I rarely separate at social events," he responded firmly. "It's one of our little traditions." Don Gustavo maintained his smile, but a muscle visibly tensed in his jaw. Of course, how considerate. The library is at the end of the main hallway. As they walked away, Eleanor felt Don Gustavo's gaze fixed on their backs like invisible daggers. "He's plotting something," she murmured. "We must be careful." Jack nodded. "Keep your eyes open, and whatever happens, let's not separate." The library was illuminated only by a desk lamp, creating elongated shadows that danced on the shelves filled with ancient books. Don Richard was seated behind an imposing mahogany desk, with a grave expression that Eleanor had never seen on her uncle's usually jovial face. "Come in," he said when he saw them in the doorway, "and close the door, please." Jack did so, making sure the latch was well secured. The silence that followed was dense, charged with tension. Finally, Don Richard spoke. "I suppose by now you know who your husband really is, Eleanor." The statement took them by surprise. Don Richard smiled joylessly at their expressions. "Did you think you could keep secret that Jack Vega is actually Alexander Walters, the last survivor of a family that we Monroes destroyed?" He slowly stood up, circling the desk to approach them. "What you probably don't know is that I always knew. In fact, I was the one who suggested his name to Don Gustavo when we were looking for an appropriate candidate for this marriage of convenience." Eleanor looked at her uncle with disbelief. "You knew? Why? Why would I facilitate the union? Have my niece with the son of our former enemies?" Don Richard poured himself a whiskey from a nearby decanter. "For the same reason you're here tonight, to stop Gustavo Velázquez before it's too late." The revelation left Eleanor and Jack momentarily speechless. Don Richard took advantage of their silence to continue. "I know what you've discovered, the transfers, the diversions of funds, the manipulation of labor conflicts. I've known it for months, but I didn't have sufficient evidence to confront him, nor allies I could trust." He put the glass on the desk and looked at them directly. "Until you two natural enemies, united by extraordinary circumstances, began to unravel the truth on your own." "I don't understand," said Eleanor, recovering her voice. "If you knew what he was doing, why didn't you stop him before?" "Because Gustavo isn't just a corrupt administrator, Eleanor. He's the guardian of family secrets that could destroy not just the Monroes, but half the aristocracy of California. secrets that go far beyond the fire at the Walters estate. He approached a painting on the wall, took it down and revealed a hidden safe. He opened it with precise movements and extracted a thick folder. This is what I've been gathering for years, the true story of our families, and the role Gustavo has played in it from the beginning. He placed the folder on the desk. But we don't have time to review it now. Gustavo suspects we've discovered him. Tonight, he plans to complete his last big transfer and disappear, and I'm afraid he has no intention of leaving witnesses who could implicate him. As if to confirm his words, a dull thud was heard from the other side of the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. They were trapped. "You meant it?" asked Stephen finally, breaking the silence that had fallen between them like a delicate veil. "That you never stopped loving me?" Madison looked at him, allowing for the first time in 15 years her eyes to reveal everything she had kept hidden. The pain, the longing, the love that had never really died, but had transformed into a constant presence, like a scar that no longer hurts but never disappears. "I tried to stop loving you," she replied honestly. "I convinced myself I had succeeded. I built a life and identity based on the denial of what I felt. But now I understand I simply buried that love beneath layers of duty and pride." She approached him, taking his hands in hers. Hands that had worked hard over the years, that had shaped the destiny of both from the shadows. "When I saw you in the field in the rain, it was as if 15 years vanished in an instant. And when I discovered everything you had done, how you had sacrificed your own life to protect me from afar," her voice broke slightly, "how could I not love you even more deeply?" Stephen drew her into an embrace that contained 15 years of waiting. "Each day," he murmured against her hair, "each decision, each sacrifice was worth it for this moment." Tato, separated slightly, looking into each other's eyes, recognizing not just the young people they once were, but the people they had become. Stronger, wiser, marked by time and circumstances, but essentially unaltered in the deepest part of their being. The kiss that followed was like returning home after a long and exhausting journey, familiar and new at the same time, a reunion and a beginning. When they finally separated, Madison rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed, absorbing the reality of his presence. "We have so much to rebuild," she whispered. "So much lost time to recover." "I don't think of it as lost time," replied Stephen softly. "These years have allowed us to grow, to learn, to become the people we needed to be to truly be together. You have learned to lead with strength, but also with compassion. I have learned patience, perseverance, to look beyond the immediate." Gently caressed her cheek. "Now we're ready to create something new together." The wisdom in his words resonated deeply with Madison. Indeed, they were no longer the passionate and idealistic young people of 15 years ago. They were adults, with scars and lessons learned, with a deeper understanding of the value of love, sacrifice, loyalty. The following days were a whirlwind of activity in St. Lawrence. The departure of Auguste Rendon and the failure of the Zarate conspiracy had left a void that needed to be filled quickly. Madison reorganized the board of directors, promoting loyal and capable people. And beside her in every decision was Stephen, not as a shadow but as an equal, contributing his unique knowledge about every aspect of the operation he had silently observed for so long. The entire valley soon learned about the events at St. Lawrence. The story of the heiress and the worker separated by ambition and reunited by destiny spread like wildfire, transforming and embellishing with each telling until it became a modern legend of Whiskey Valley. Competing distilleries watched, with caution, but also with a new respect. The alliance between the sophisticated administrator and the expert connoisseur of agave promised a new era for St. Lawrence, perhaps for the entire industry. One afternoon, as the sun began to descend over the agave fields, tinting everything, with a reddish gold that seemed to transform the plants into living flames, Madison and Stephen walked together among the crops. 3 months had passed since the confrontation in the boardroom, 3 months of intense work, but also of mutual rediscovery, of deep conversations that extended until dawn, of shared laughter and occasionally tears for the time lost that, as Stephen insisted, wasn't really lost but had been necessary. "I've been thinking," said Madison, stopping beside a particularly beautiful agave plant, its bluish leaves spread like a living star, "about what you said about the underground spring." Stephen looked at her curiously. He had noticed that in recent days her mind seemed occupied with some idea she hadn't yet fully shared. "What about the spring?" he asked. "Philip Zarate was right about one thing," she replied, caressing the pointed leaf of the agave. "Water is the most valuable resource, especially now with climate change affecting rain patterns. Many small distilleries are struggling because their agave fields don't receive enough water." She turned to him, her eyes bright with the intensity that always appeared when a new idea was taking shape in her mind. "What if we shared our treasure? Not to sell to the highest bidder, but to create a community irrigation system that benefits all the producers in the valley, especially the small farmers who don't have the resources to drill deep wells." Stephen looked at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. It was a revolutionary proposal, going against all the traditional competitive logic of the industry. It was also precisely the type of innovative and compassionate thinking that characterized the true Madison, the woman who had seen beyond social differences to love a simple worker 15 years ago. It would transform the entire valley, he reflected, visualizing the implications. It would certainly change the balance of power. The Zarates and other big families would have to adapt to a new model where cooperation is as important as competition. "Exactly," she nodded enthusiastically. "And St. Lawrence would lead that transformation, not as owners of the water, but as stewards of a common resource. We could establish a cooperative with representatives from all distilleries, large and small, to manage the system." She took his hands, her expression mixing determination and vulnerability. "What do you think? Is it crazy?" Stephen looked at her deeply, marveling once more at the woman before him. "It's exactly the kind of craziness that changes the world," he responded. "And it's perfectly fitting that it comes from you, the woman who is changing mine every day." He kissed her gently, sealing without words his support for the vision she had just shared. "It will be difficult," he warned when they separated. "We'll face resistance, not just from the Zarates, but from all who benefit from the current system. We'll face it together," she replied simply, "as we should have done 15 years ago, as we will do now and always." The community irrigation system project advanced rapidly in the following months. As expected, it encountered initial resistance among some of the big producers, but to the surprise of many, Philip Zarate eventually became one of its most vocal defenders, perhaps recognizing an opportunity for redemption or simply adapting to a new reality he couldn't effectively fight. The transformation of St. Lawrence was equally profound. Under the joint leadership of Madison and Stephen, the distillery expanded its sustainable practices, improving working conditions and establishing educational programs for workers' children. The old abandoned distillery, where their love story had begun, was restored as a living museum of whiskey traditions, keeping ancient techniques alive, alongside modern innovations. And as the irrigation system began to function, especially benefiting small producers, the entire valley seemed to flourish with renewed vitality. The blue agave grew stronger and healthier. The quality of whiskey produced throughout the region notably improved, and a new era of collaboration slowly replaced the old rivalries and conflicts. A year after that rainy day when Madison had found Stephen among the rubble, both walked hand in hand along the paths of St. Lawrence. The estate, always imposing, now seemed more welcoming. The stone walls softened by flourishing vines, the inner courtyards animated by the sound of laughter and conversations from workers who no longer saw Madison as the unreachable ice queen, but as a respected and beloved leader. "Do you remember what you told me that night in the abandoned distillery?" asked Madison, stopping beside a century-old fountain that bubbled cheerfully in the center of the main courtyard. "Which part?" replied Stephen with a smile. "I said many things that night after 15 years of silence." She returned his smile, squeezing his hand with affection. "You said you didn't consider those 15 years as lost time, but as a necessary period for both of us to become the people we needed to be." "I remember," he nodded, "and I still believe it." "I believe it now too," she said, her voice soft but firm. "My father was right about one thing. The true legacy isn't properties or names, but the happiness of those we love. But he was also wrong in thinking that legacy could only be preserved by following the path he had laid out." She turned to face him completely, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the sunset. "These months with you have taught me that true. Legacies aren't built with rigidity and control, but with love, trust, and the courage to transform when necessary." Stephen drew her to him, embracing her with the reverence he always felt having her in his arms, as if a part of him still couldn't believe this moment had finally arrived. "And you've taught me," he murmured against her hair, "that some things are worth the wait, no matter how long it is." They separated slightly, and Madison noticed there was a different gleam in Stephen's eyes, a mixture of nervousness and determination she had rarely seen in him. "What is it?" she asked, intrigued. In response, Stephen extracted a small carved wooden box from his pocket. It wasn't a luxurious jewel like those wealthy suitors had offered Madison in the past, but a unique piece, handcrafted with evident care and affection. "I made it myself," he explained, as he slowly opened it to reveal a ring. It wasn't gold or platinum, but Mexican silver worked in filigree, with small fragments of black obsidian inlaid in a pattern that vaguely resembled agave leaves. "The silver is from the first payment I received as an independent consultant after your father stopped blocking my career. The obsidian I found in the fields of St. Lawrence the day we met." Madison held her breath, moved by the symbolism of the object and by the moment unfolding between them. "Madison Figueroa," continued Stephen, his voice firm despite the emotion. He clearly felt, "I loved you in silence for 15 years. Now I want to love you openly for the rest of my life. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The tears Madison had contained for so many years, which had begun to flow freely in recent months as she rediscovered her capacity to fully feel, ran down her cheeks without restriction. "Yes," she responded simply, her voice barely a whisper, but loaded with certainty. "Yes, Stephen Montgomery, 1,000 times yes." When the ring found its place on her finger, she felt a circle being completed, not the end of a journey, but the true beginning of a new one. A path both would travel together, not as heiress and worker, not as businesswoman and consultant, but simply as Madison and Stephen, two people who had discovered that true love knows no barriers of class or time. The news of their engagement spread rapidly throughout Whiskey Valley, provoking spontaneous celebrations in the surrounding communities. For many, it represented more than the union of two people. It symbolized a new era for the region, where old divisions began to dissolve, in favor of a more inclusive and collaborative vision. The wedding was celebrated 6 months later, in the gardens of St. Lawrence Estate. It wasn't the ostentatious display of power and wealth that would have been expected from the heiress of the most important whiskey empire in America, but an intimate yet vibrant ceremony, combining ancestral traditions with personal touches that reflected the unique history of the couple. Isabel, who had finally accepted Madison as part of her family, led the preparations along with Mrs. Soledad, creating an event that many would later describe as magical. The ceremony, held under an ancient mesquite, tree that had witnessed generations of the estate's history, was officiated by Mr. Nicholas, the old whiskey master who had been the first to reveal to Madison the truth about her past. His words, simple but profound, resonated among the attendees. In the process of making whiskey, we learn that transformation is the essence of life. The agave grows for years, accumulating experience and sweetness in its heart before being ready to become something new. Madison and Stephen have followed a similar path, maturing separately to be able to create something extraordinary together. And when the sun began to set over the agave fields, tinting the sky with the same reddish and golden tones that had witnessed their reunion a year before, Madison and Stephen shared their first dance as a married couple. The guests formed a circle around them, watching with emotion as they moved to the rhythm of an ancient love song performed by local musicians. "Are you happy?" asked Stephen, as they slowly turned in time with the music. Madison looked into his eyes, finding in them the same love that had remained constant throughout all these years, through separations and reunions, secrets and revelations. "More than happy," she responded sincerely. "I am complete." And as the music continued and night gently fell over Whiskey Valley, both knew they had finally found not just the love they once believed lost, but also a greater purpose, to transform St. Lawrence and the entire valley into a place where stories like theirs wouldn't have to develop in the shadows, where a person's value wouldn't be measured by their name or position, but by the integrity of their actions and the depth of their feelings. A place where the true legacy would be, as Mr. Richard had understood too late, the happiness of those we love. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Madison and Stephen has deeply moved you. To continue this emotional journey through the lands of Blue Agave, we have prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about loves that transcend social and temporal barriers. Find it here by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this narrative about the transformative power of love and truth, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like.